Thacher Island, Rockport, Massachusetts, home to the Twin Lights. At 54 acres, Thacher is the largest of 3 islands located just east of Rockport, Massachusetts. In 1605, explorer Samuel de Champlain named these islands Les Trois Sauvages, the Wild Trio. When John Smith sailed by, 10 years later, he named the trio the Three Turks' Heads. But the current name of the island came from the lone survivors of a horrible wreck in 1635. Anthony Thacher, Englishman, Puritan, Pilgrim. What we know of this tragedy comes from a letter Anthony Thacher wrote to his brother Peter. The letter was later published by Increase Mather in his book Remarkable Providences. On Wednesday, August 14, 1635, Anthony Thacher, his wife Elizabeth, and his 5 children were on a boat named the Watch and Wait, on their way from Ipswich to Marblehead. The Thachers were traveling with Anthony's best friend, Reverend Joseph Avery, Avery's wife, and Avery's 8 children. Reverend Avery had been asked to go to Marblehead to start a new parish. The weather was bad before they left Ipswich at dawn on Wednesday. They sailed 3 days into the wind in a square-rigged vessel, rounding the Cape on Friday night. As they began to sail southward, the winds increased beyond imagination. They were sailing into the great colonial hurricane of 1635. Such a mighty storm of wind and rain as none living in these parts, either English or Indian, ever saw. In the 1990s, Brian Jarvinen created a model of the storm from contemporaneous reports. Maximum observed storm surges were 14 feet at Providence, Rhode Island, above 20 feet at the head of Buzzards Bay, Massachusetts. This was probably the most intense hurricane in New England history. As it rounded Cape Ann, the sails of the Watch and Wait were torn and useless in the hurricane winds. The captain chose to drop anchor in Sandy Bay and leave the sails repair to morning's light. But the anchors did not hold, and they foundered on the dangerous reefs of Sandy Bay. And as my cousin, his wife, and my tender babes sat comforting and cheering each other in the Lord against the ghastly death which every moment stared us in the face and sat triumphing in each other's forehead, we were, by the violence and fury of the winds, by the Lord's permission, lifted upon a rock between 2 high rocks, yet all was one rock. But it raged with the stroke which came into the pinnace, so as we were presently up to our middles as we sat. Now look with me upon my distress and consider my misery. My goods and provisions swimming in the seas, my friends almost drowned, and mine own poor children so untimely, before mine eyes drowned and ready to be swallowed up, and dashed to pieces against the rocks by the merciless waves, and myself ready to accompany them. Only Thacher and his wife survived, somehow reaching the island that would later bear his name. His children, gone. His best friend, Avery, and his family, gone. The captain and crew and other passengers, 21 souls in all, gone. Thacher and his wife found the remains of only one other passenger, a daughter of Reverend Avery, whom they buried on the island. But they did find supplies from the wreck and used them to survive until rescue. There we remained till Monday following, when about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, in a boat that came that way, we went off that desolate island, which I named after my name, Thatcher's Woe, and the rock, Avery his fall, to the end that their fall and loss and mine own might be in perpetual remembrance. The colonial government, hearing the enormity of the tragedy, gave the Thachers a small compensation for the loss of their goods. And a few months later, although it could be no compensation for the loss of his children and friends, gave them the island as well. Thus it bears the Thacher name to this day. Anne's Eyes, the first set of towers. Anthony Thacher and his wife left Marblehead after settling his friend Avery's affairs, and went on to start a new family and found the town of Yarmouth, Massachusetts. The Thatcher family kept the island for roughly 80 years, though none of them ever came to claim the place as home. In the early 1700s, the Thatcher family sold it to the first in a series of Gloucestermen, who used it to pasture oxen. The island itself, however, gained prominence due to its central location in colonial trade, combined with the incredible danger of its eastern submerged twin, the Londoner. There were no planes, trains, or automobiles. The 13 colonies relied on water transport for trade between themselves and with other countries. Ships to and from continental Europe, England, Maine, and Canada all passed this dangerous site. It was a particularly hazardous area, especially at night. In the mid-1700s, John Hancock, an influential leader in the shipping business and soon to be known by his gigantic signature, needed his ships to be more efficient and sail at all hours. Hancock petitioned the colony to provide for a Cape Ann light, proposing that the Boston shipowners pay light money to build and keep the station up. In 1771, the colony created a committee which was authorized to buy the island and, quote, erect a lighthouse or houses and a convenient house for the keeper, end quote. This light needed to look different from others in New England for two reasons. First, navigation was not an exact science at the time. A mariner from Europe aiming roughly for the Massachusetts Bay Colony might well see this light before any others. The Cape Ann light needed to be distinctive from the existing single lights in Boston to the south or Portsmouth to the north. Also, it was the first built in the American colonies to mark a dangerous spot instead of the opening to a harbor. And thus, two towers were constructed, immediately distinctive from the others. This was the last light station built by the then British colonial government. It seems impossible that we have no accurate drawings of the original towers, but that is the case. This painting of an incident from the War of 1812 should have the right towers, but as the little boats in the foreground make clear, the dimensions can't be trusted, so we must be satisfied with other towers built close in time and described similarly, such as this light at 10-Pound Island, built in the early 1800s, or this light at Ned's Point with its rubble and limestone base, wooden tower, and birdcage light room. The original twin light towers were only 40 feet in height and were little more than candle chandeliers at the top of an enclosed staircase, which was state-of-the-art at the time. But brilliantly, just like the second set of towers, the original two towers were placed on a north-south axis, marking the extent of the Londoner. That meant that they could be used either to adjust a compass or to get a rough sense of heading even without a compass. The Cape Ann lights were lit for the very first time on December 2, 1771, to much celebration. They were nicknamed Ann's Eyes. In 1790, President Washington, realizing the importance of lighthouses to the country's growth, signed an act to take over all lighthouses as federal property and assigned his Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, to manage them. Hamilton appointed the first keeper on Thacher Island, named Samuel Houston, in 1790. The heart of a light station is the light. Lighthouses were not always such magnificent monuments to engineering and science. The first light stations were merely fires on the beach. Problem: beach fires can't be seen from very far away at sea level. Solution: raise the fire higher. The most famous lighthouse of the ancient world, Pharos at Alexandria, Egypt. Essentially a bonfire at the top of a very tall building. Problems: wood and coal as fuel, too much labor, wood hard to get, inconsistent light.
Solution: candle chandeliers or multi-wick lamps. Problem: fat wick smoke due to incomplete combustion. Solution: create hollow, circular wick with airflow in the center, like the Argand lamp of 1780. Problem: in addition to creating soot and smoke, multi-wick lamps like spider lamps were hard to fuel in service. Solution: create a tank which feeds fuel to the lamp. Problem: lamps still not bright enough, wasting light by sending it in all directions. Solution: add a reflector behind the light. Problem: light still going off in all directions. Solution: add a lens. A lens can bend the light so that it all goes in the same direction. In 1812, former ship captain Winslow Lewis received a U.S. patent for his design that combined a circular wick lamp, a reflector, and a lens. He tested the design in the South Tower at Thacher Island and won the federal contract for all lighthouse lighting and light maintenance for the next 7 years. Problem: light still being wasted. Bigger lenses too heavy and thick. Solution: Fresnel lens. Augustin Fresnel, a French physicist, noticed that the work of a lens is done at the surfaces. As lights got bigger, lenses needed to be bigger. More glass for the light to travel through meant a dimmer light. Fresnel's genius was to remove unnecessary glass and use just the surfaces. He used a series of prisms to bend the light with a minimum of glass. To capture even more light, Fresnel added mirrors or reflecting prisms to the top and bottom, and arranged these panels of prisms into a beehive shape. The result was a flat plane of light that spread out like a giant light disk from the tower. When the second set of towers were built on Thacher Island, just prior to the Civil War, they included first-order Fresnel lenses, the largest. Now that the lens surrounded the light, there was no need for the reflectors behind the flame, and the fuel reservoir could be tucked underneath. Each of the Thatcher lights had a 5-wick funk moderator float lamp, like this one, at its center. Although the candle power that became available from electrical lamps eventually made it unnecessary, the Fresnel lens system itself was never outperformed. Thacher Island, the second set of lights. The original Thatcher towers were in constant need of repair. Wood, paint, rubble stone, and lime were little match for the wind and salt of open sea exposure. By 1850, the U.S. government had surveyed 70,000 vessels passing Thatcher annually. More traffic through this dangerous area meant more ships at risk. This light station needed an upgrade. Ship owners who had business in Europe noticed that by 1830 France was lighting up the English Channel with the Fresnel lenses. To take full advantage of the largest Fresnel lenses, taller, more sturdy towers with larger lantern rooms were needed. Thus, the second towers were made of stone. Each external granite block in the 125-foot-high towers was hand-carved and fitted together on land, then numbered, dismantled, and transported out to the island to be rebuilt. Surprisingly, the granite in these towers is not from Cape Ann, but rather New Hampshire. On site, they stand 165 feet above sea level. When lit, they are visible by the naked eye up to 22 miles away. Inside the elegant stone is an inner sleeve of brick, and inside that, a wrought iron staircase. In 1861, the current towers were completed. Also in 1861, a brick keeper's house was built near the South Tower. It housed 2 families. At that time, there was also a North Tower keeper's house and covered walkways from the houses to the towers. A whistle house, or fog signal, was added to the island to warn ships from the Londoner in heavy fog. A rail system was built to move materials to the towers, houses, and whistle. With the new towers and many outbuildings, there was a great deal of work to do on the island. Keepers had to climb each tower's 157 steps every 4 hours to trim wicks, add oil, and clean the lantern room glass and the hundreds of prisms in each Fresnel lens. During fog, the whistle or foghorn had to be carefully managed to keep the steam at a proper pressure. In addition, The keepers grew their own food, hauled the coal and lighthouse supplies, and were responsible for all repairs. At some points, as many as 5 keepers and their families were living on the island. In 1939, the Coast Guard took control of the station. 3 to 6 man crews tended the lights until 1980, when the Coast Guard automated them using solar power. After installing much brighter automated electric lights, the Coast Guard removed the Fresnel lens from the South Tower. It was housed at the Coast Guard Academy for a while, but has now been returned to Cape Ann and is on display at the Cape Ann Museum. Thacher Island, then and now. The island has seen over 150 keepers and assistants, as well as hundreds of Coast Guardsmen who served there after 1939. Perhaps the best-known story is that of Maria Bray. Alexander Bray was the first principal keeper of the new lighthouses in 1864. 3 days before Christmas, he decided to transport his assistant keeper to the mainland for medical treatment. A freak storm blew in, preventing his return to the island. His wife Maria was left in charge of the island, along with her 12-year-old nephew, Sidney Haskell. For 3 days and nights, Maria and her nephew fought the wind and snow, climbed the 157 steps in each tower, trimmed the wicks, filled the oil tanks, and cleaned the lantern room glass and lenses. Then back down the 157 stairs and out into the drifts and gale to the other tower. Each round trip, a quarter mile in the blinding snow. Alexander Bray was able to return on Christmas Eve day, but only because Maria had kept the lights burning to guide him. In 2000, the U.S. Coast Guard named a 175-foot keeper-class coastal buoy tender after her. The U.S. CGC Maria Bray. In 1919, it was the whistle house and an observant keeper that warned a ship off the Londoner in heavy fog. The keeper, Maurice Babcock, ran the horn insistently until he saw the giant vessel shudder to a stop and back slowly away. The ship was the liner George Washington, which held President Woodrow Wilson and then Secretary of the Navy Franklin D. Roosevelt, returning from peace talks in Europe ending World War I. While the Coast Guard was in charge, the island had a few more uses, including housing a Cosa Nostra informer under Federal Witness Protection Program in 1967. Joe the Animal Barboza Barron was hidden out at the island and guarded by 16 FBI agents and federal marshals. In 1974, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service took ownership of the northern part of the island. It is currently a wildlife refuge. In 1980, the Thacher Island Association was formed to manage and fund restoration. In 2000, the town of Rockport took ownership of the southern end. In 2001, the Cape Ann Light Station was designated a National Historic Landmark. The Thacher Island Association has repaired the keepers' houses, the whistle house, boat ramp, and other structures, as well as clearing trails. They have tours in the summer months and run a museum on site.